Welcome to the coffee morning, where we will discuss Farewell to Adventure, have a chance to catch up on the film and the process of making this film, and also talk more about that. So I'm Alex, and I'm joined today by Chris Prescott, the director of Farewell to Adventure, a film that really resonated with me and that we'll talk about in more detail this morning. You're all more than welcome to participate, to ask questions, or tell us about your reaction or experience of watching this film. You can do that by posting your questions or comments in the chat here on Zoom, or in the comment section on Facebook, or just ask directly on Zoom here by unmuting yourselves. This event, as you can see, is recorded and will also be posted later on our website if you'd like to catch up on or share with anyone else. Farewell to Adventure is one of the 3 films made part of the Right Here program. It was first broadcast on BBC Scotland, I think a few weeks ago. And if you haven't watched it yet, it is still available to watch on BBC iPlayer. It's a really moving documentary about adventure, about aging, and above all, I think about love as well, by following the story of Bob Shepton, an experienced Arctic explorer who has led numerous expeditions to the Canadian Arctic and Greenland, and his wife of 55 years, Kate, who has Alzheimer's. And Chris has captured this moment in their lives as they're facing changes and adapting to a new reality. And before we talk about the film, I also wanted to talk about kind of adventure filmmaking. Doing a bit of research for this coffee morning, I found out that there is a very kind of vibrant and very kind of community-oriented group of filmmakers who are exploring kind of doing adventure filmmaking, focusing on that. And it's in some ways a genre of documentary filmmaking in itself. So do you tell us a bit more about that and also about your background, and how you started making adventure films and photography as well? Which passion was first? Was it filmmaking? Was it climbing?
It was kind of both, actually. It was quite a weird one. It was I was into photography and I was into climbing, and it was quite a few years before I even really realized that you could combine the two. But yeah, no, adventure filmmaking is definitely quite a kind of, as you say, vibrant but niche kind of part of documentary filmmaking. It's a growing thing as well. It's funny. I mean, I've been making films for just over 10 years, and just even in that 10 years, I've noticed that there's now so many more people who are interested in kind of making adventure film. I mean, I guess for those who maybe don't know, adventure film, I guess, is anything that encompasses kind of the outdoors, adventure sports. So I do a lot of documentaries about climbing and mountain biking and skiing, out like mountaineering, anything like that, really. But there's a whole community of people that do it, and there's quite a few kind of mountaineering mountain film festivals around the world as well. So there's kind of there's a big one in Canada, there's quite a few in the UK, all over Europe. So there's definitely a demand for that kind of adventure film, but it's kind of, I think it's weird when you're in it, you're obviously very much aware of it, but then you speak to other filmmakers or other people who aren't interested in that world as much, and they have no idea that there's this whole community of people making films about the outdoors. It's quite funny, really.
Yeah, so what are the kind of challenges or also skills that you kind of need, I think, to do this, to kind of be an adventure filmmaker?
Yeah, I think it's quite a few. It definitely helps if you're into kind of the outdoors, or the things that you're trying to shoot. It certainly is a help for that. The challenges are often locations are often very difficult. They're kind of especially in the mountains, it's bad weather, it takes forever to get there, you have to carry all your kits, everything else. A lot of what I do is I do a lot of filming of climbing, so it's sort of remote access, so you have to rig ropes and you have to have certain positions, and you can spend a lot of time there because climbing takes a long time anyway, and then as soon as you start trying to film it as well, it just adds this whole other element of kind of faff into it. You know, it takes forever for me to get into position, and then the climber climbs up a bit, and there's a lot of that goes on. But I'd say, especially in the UK, it's a lot of it's to do with weather. It's always bad weather, basically. It's I guess that's the main challenge, really.
So are you mainly kind of focusing on in filming around the UK, or have you explored other parts of the world as well?
In the last 18 months, it's very much been the UK. It's been quite a different kind of change in life, really, just pre-pandemic and now. I mean, pre-pandemic, I'd be traveling all the time, pretty much constantly, like all over the world. And then since the start of COVID, it's just obviously made that a lot more difficult. So a lot of the projects over the last 18 months have been in the UK. That's just purely because travel is so difficult. But it's actually been quite nice, you know, you realise that there's quite a few just really interesting stories at home. It's always been this temptation to kind of jet off somewhere really exotic, but actually you don't really need to do that necessarily.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also as a viewer, as an audience member who's also stuck at home for so many months, I think watching these kinds of films is very interesting, and kind of it's a way for us to kind of view nature as well, and to feel a bit more immersed in that while we can't be actually there. So
yeah, I think it's a difficult one as well. It's definitely something that I've juggled with as well, is this often people who are in the kind of outdoor world are very aware of like issues with the climate. You see it very firsthand, kind of how much the climate's changed. I mean, I lived in Chamonix for quite a long time, and you see like the glacial retreat there, for example. And so a lot of the time, these people, you know, you're very vocal about these issues, and yet you're also then jetting off all over the world to film in like in different places, you know. And it's definitely a bit of a battle, which I think only in the last kind of few years has really started to be talked about more, is this idea that it's that balance between flying somewhere to promote, or, you know, to show these environments and then potentially have a climate message, but then are you completely hypocritical by talking about the climate whilst also flying all over the world to these exotic locations? So I guess that in some way, I think over the last 18 months, it's felt quite good that I've been traveling a lot less. And then you definitely start to realize that you don't need to travel.
Yeah, so I think now I wanted to ask about the film, about Farewell to Adventure. When did the project start? And also, how did you decide to make a film about Bob and about this particular moment in his life?
Yeah, so it's a funny one. I first became aware of Bob in 2009, I guess it would be. He went on these amazing trips to Greenland with this crazy group of sort of Belgian climbers that he's dubbed the Wild Bunch. But they're very, very accomplished climbers. They climb big wall climbs all over the world. And he was basically, they hired him as a skipper to sail them to Greenland on his little sailboat. And they made a series of films as part of that trip, which I remember seeing kind of, it was pretty early days of YouTube, and it was kind of, they put them onto YouTube, and it was like, I think it was just seeing the amount of fun that they were having despite being in a very like remote and potentially dangerous location. And it was just like, it was pure fun. Like they take musical instruments on the walls and they have like jam sessions, and Bob very much was part of this kind of this group. And I loved those series of films, and I watched them over and over and over again. And then in 2017, I was making a film about a guy called Dave McLeod. He's a Scottish climber. And he met Bob at a film festival. Bob was at the festival because he'd just made another film with these Belgian guys. And he basically started speaking to Dave, and basically had convinced Dave to go to St Kilda, which is this sort of remote little archipelago of islands, sort of out from the Outer Hebrides into the North Atlantic. It's just a crazy place, really remote, but sort of climbing potential there, but not many people have climbed there. And Bob basically convinced Dave to go on a trip to St Kilda on his little sailboat to go and explore the climbing there. And as I was already making a film with Dave, we ended up sort of making that part of sort of the kind of the ending of the film was going out to St Kilda. So I met Bob on that trip, which it was kind of strange because I'd watched those films that he'd made so many times that I already knew Bob. I felt like I knew Bob very well, but I also like knew the boats. It was almost like being on a film set. It was quite strange. So we went on that trip, and it was really during that trip that at first, like, Bob was just going to be this kind of secondary character, that he was just the skipper of the boat and he was just getting there. But it's very hard to ignore Bob. Like, he's a very interesting character, and it was only on that trip that, you know, through talking to him more and more, you just realize quite how interesting his life is. And it was, I remember the very ending of the trip, I needed to get like a little interview with Bob just to kind of tie up a few things. And so we were all exhausted. We were like 2 weeks into this trip. We were just, all we wanted to do was get off the boat. And I was like, the last thing I need to do is interview Bob. And I was like, it'll be like half an hour max. And I think I ended up interviewing him for 4.5 hours or something. Because as soon as, he's one of those people, as soon as you start speaking to him, he'll drop into conversation, something new, and you just realize just how many adventurous things he's done, but also just how interesting his life has been in general. So I think doing that interview, I kind of started to realize that he was a really interesting character, and that there was an amazing, you know, you could definitely make a documentary with him, because the films that he'd always made before, he again was he was a character within a wider group of characters, but very little was talked about his kind of background and stuff. So when that film premiered, I asked Bob at the kind of festival whether he'd be interested in doing something, and he said yes. But then at that point, we didn't really kind of know what that would be. And then I saw Right Here with SDI, and then I applied for that, and then that's basically how the film started, really. So, but say the whole story around Kate and the Alzheimer's and everything, that was just, I guess, in some ways, it was one of those sort of documentary gifts that you sometimes find, where you start with one thing and it ends up being something completely different. So when we went to St Kilda with Bob, Kate, I think, was in the fairly sort of early stages of Alzheimer's. It'd been fairly recently diagnosed, but she was still at home and able to look after herself. But I remember being on that trip, and at one point Bob was contacted by the Coast Guard, basically, and they'd had a mess. Kate had contacted them saying that she didn't know where Bob was, and so Bob had to kind of deal with this slightly difficult situation through the radio on the boat, essentially. And then through that, so we started to get this idea that maybe, you know, Kate was having some difficulties, I guess. So I knew that was kind of in the background, but it just happened that when we started filming for Farewell to Adventure, Kate's condition definitely got worse, and that really kind of changed a lot of things. I mean, it changed, primarily it was the amount of time that Bob was able to spend away from home. He used to be able to kind of go away for a couple of weeks at a time and just have someone call in to check on Kate, whereas then it really came down to kind of, he couldn't really leave her for a full day. So it really kind of, sort of, her condition deteriorated quite rapidly, kind of just at the right time, that's the wrong word, just at the time that we started filming, basically. And that really just completely changed the narrative of the film, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how do you approach these kinds of moments in the filmmaking process, where you think you're going with a certain story or a certain approach, and then things change and you have to adapt and to find new kind of ways of telling the story?
Yeah, I mean, I think being a documentary filmmaker, it's just a bit of a given that you kind of always just follow what the story is. And I guess with the background in the adventure side of things, often stories are very, very fast moving and things change within seconds. You know, I've had it before where, you know, you'll be filming one thing and then, you know, someone will have an accident or something, and then you completely end up sort of swerving off into something else. So I guess I'm quite used to this idea that you start a film with one idea, but then it could potentially just completely change and you end up with something completely different. And I think it's just important to be aware of that and just understand where the interesting stories are and just kind of follow that. I think it kind of helps with Bob as well. He has two sides to his character. He's very much of his generation, and he's quite reserved about talking about personal feelings, but then at the same time is very open to discussing what's happening at home and things like that. So that certainly helps initially. I mean, I think maybe some people would have been a bit more guarded about talking about their wife having Alzheimer's, whereas Bob was very open about it and quite matter of fact. So I think it was quite obvious that there was this problem at home and that, you know, that was causing issue. I mean that this is really where the conflict was in the film. I mean, Bob has essentially been given free rein for 40, 50 years just to go off and do what he wants. And it was only really this was the kind of the first time where he couldn't just make decisions based on what he wanted to do. It was very much what, you know, what was dictated by Kate. And so I think Bob was very torn about this. You know, it was a huge change in his life. And so as you say, you see that happening. It's very hard not to then see that that's where the story is, really.
Yeah, that definitely comes across, and also this kind of idea of or this kind of relationship and this kind of marriage and how it evolves and changes over time, and I thought that was really interesting because it really showed a different side of Bob as well, who, as you said, has appeared in many other films where he's leading these amazing expeditions and adventures, and then kind of, yeah, in this film you're also going into his kind of home space and family life. And
yeah, very different. I think that was a few people I've spoken to were a bit kind of I guess caught off guard by that, because the other films that he's been in are very like they're pure fun. It's like you laugh a lot and it's really enjoyable, and it's all about the kind of adventure and having fun. Whereas obviously, and so if you associate Bob with that and you go into this thinking it's going to be like that, it's a bit of a shock when it's not. But hey, it's nice. I enjoy showing other sides to things and putting new views on, you know, things that you may have already seen. So
yeah. So how was it kind of getting the trust, or kind of getting that kind of building that relationship with Bob and also with Kate, and how did that work making the film?
Yeah, I think I was quite lucky in that I'd made this film with Dave before, and Bob was kind of involved with that, and so it's hard not to spend a lot of time with people in a small sailboat. So we'd spent a huge amount of time on that trip and grown very friendly with Bob there. So I think there was that. I think maybe I would have struggled more if the first time I'd met Bob was when we started filming this. Whereas because he's a friend, I guess he's a lot more open with me and a lot more candid. And that I think really, really helped. Kate was obviously different. I mean, I hadn't actually met Kate before we started filming. And to be honest, I was really nervous the first time that I met her. It was quite a lot. I mean, there was nerves around kind of how she would be and how she would respond to me and the camera. But there was also the added thing of COVID was a huge thing. It's hard not to, you know, COVID doesn't enter into the film because I really didn't want it to be, you know, it's just all pervading at the moment. I just didn't want it to be a thing in the film, but just to even be able to go and film and be safe, it was a huge amount of, you know, I had to isolate for 2 weeks. I had to have COVID tests and drive straight there. And yet I was still really worried that I would end up passing COVID on. So there was that added nerves as well. So it was the first time I went to the house, I was quite nervous, but then fortunately it was quite okay. I mean, the first time she was definitely a bit more, I don't know what the right word is, confused and a bit guarded, but having Alzheimer's, though, it completely changes that dynamic anyway. I mean, I filmed with people who are quite unwilling to be on camera in the past, but they're very much aware of that decision, whereas Kate, because of the Alzheimer's, was always a bit kind of confused. I mean, the difficulty often was that you'd turn up and you'd turn up with a camera and she'd be really interested in what the camera is, and you'd explain everything to her and she'd be like, okay, that's fine. And then you'd film for a few minutes and then she would forget, and then she'd be like, oh, so what's this camera and who are you? And so there was that kind of the first visit was very much a lot of that, but I think over time she just kind of got used to me being there. And that kind of, when once that had kind of gotten out of the way, it was fine. I mean, she'd still come out with really ridiculous things sometimes, but that's just, I mean, I guess in some ways that's the part of Alzheimer's that maybe isn't, I don't know, maybe it's not correct to talk about, but obviously Alzheimer's is a terrible thing, but at times it can manifest itself and actually being quite amusing. Like Kate was very, very funny because she kind of, her inhibitions are lowered, and so she would just say whatever she wanted to say, and often it was very amusing, which is kind of, I really enjoyed spending time with them because Kate would constantly be making jokes about Bob and things like this, and I although she has had quite advanced Alzheimer's, you could definitely get a feel for her character. She had a very like cutting sort of Irish wit about her, and it was really enjoyable kind of seeing that come through at times. I mean, sometimes she would really struggle. She wouldn't recognize herself in photos, for example. And yet then she would, Bob would say something and she completely cut him down with, a really sort of dry sense of humor. So it actually ended up being that I was quite looking, I would look forward to going to visit because it was enjoyable to spend time with them. So.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is also really important to kind of show on screen and on film, and to show these kind of different experiences and different kind of ways of dealing, both from the perspective of the person who is going through this, but also through the perspective of the carer and the person who is dealing with this for the first time.
Yeah. I'd also add, though, it's just also, there is that tricky balance though between being a friend, but then also being aware that you're a documentary filmmaker and you're there to kind of be more observational. So it's a very tricky balance, especially with someone like Bob, who I knew quite well before, and it's kind of hard not to kind of see things in a certain way. So that is always quite tricky. But often as well, I think the other issue often is with these things is that I've been on shoots before where you have a huge crew of people, and instantly that just makes people feel uncomfortable. You sat in your house, but you have 5 people there. So I often, especially at the start of films, I will just put a camera on a tripod just off to one side, and then you just essentially try and make them forget about it, and you just chat to them and stuff. But as I say, is that really, I do always struggle often with that thing of you're there to portray reality, but then it's hard not to then get drawn into being friends and portraying things in a certain way. And I say Bob actually hasn't seen the film yet, and so I don't know exactly how he will react to it, I guess. As you say, it's a very different side to Bob. I mean, I'm sure he'll be fine. He's very matter of fact, and he's not portrayed in any way other than the way he is. But I'm interested to see what he thinks of it when he does finally get around to watching it.
Yeah, it's unfortunately we couldn't have him joining us in the Q&A today because he's, I believe, in another trip.
Yeah, so that's life has changed for Bob again, really, since making the film. Unfortunately, Kate passed away in earlier this year, and I think it was very bittersweet for Bob. It's kind of, obviously, losing your wife is very traumatic, but Bob, being the way that he is, he's very matter of fact about these things, and so I think it's kind of, he then saw a way to then be able to carry on with, I mean, not to the same extent, but be able to kind of live a bit more of that kind of life that he was used to. He still sort of sold the boat, but a friend of his asked if he would like to join him on sailing his boat down to the Canary Islands. So Bob has decided he's off on that trip and has been there for a few weeks. So I think he's kind of enjoying being back in that kind of boat environment again. I think it's after so many years, I think it's just such a part of him that he feels almost more at home on a boat than he does at home. And I think especially since Kate passed away, I think being at home on your own is a very different prospect as well. So I think he was probably quite relieved to have that offer to go off and sail, I think.
Yeah, could you actually tell us a bit more about how it is like filming on that boat, on the sailing boat? How could you describe maybe the day and how it looks?
Yeah, it can be pretty horrible if you're not used to sailing, put it that way. The first trip that we did, it was definitely quite a baptism of fire, really. I mean, the three of us that went on the trip, we were all climbers, but we were in no way sailors whatsoever. And I grew up on the Isle of Man, so I'm quite used to sailing in some regards, and I'm used to rough weather, but nothing prepared me for spending weeks on a tiny little sailboat in like really rough weather. And I don't know how to put this politely. The boat is not the cleanest of environments at times. It's like, it smells like diesel. There's like seawater everywhere, and it's just a pretty horrible place to be. So yeah, it's a tough place. I find it quite tough because for many reasons. I mean, personally, you're just trying to not feel seasick the whole time and just kind of live in that environment. But then obviously you also have to be filming as well, which is also very difficult on a cramped little sailboat. I mean, the inside, the cabin of the boat is very, very small. And then outside, you know, the boat's moving all around the place. There's spray coming over the sides, so your cameras get wet. It's difficult, yeah. But I like that though in some ways. I like the challenge of filming in those environments. I guess in a lot of ways, it's like filming in the mountains where you've got all these other things going on, but then you also have to manage the filmmaking side of it as well. But I certainly don't think I'll be taking up sailing anytime soon. So both trips that I've been on the boat with Bob, it's been terrible weather. But hey, I guess that's part of sailing. Whereas then Bob in that environment is just completely at home. And actually Bob in some ways I think is a very kind of like stabilizing character in those environments where especially on the trip to St Kilda, we had to do this crossing from the Outer Hebrides to St Kilda, which is about 50 miles or something like that. And on a nice day in a speedboat, it takes a couple of hours, but it took us 14 hours, I think it was, in a really severe storm. I mean, I think we misjudged how bad the weather was going to be, and so the boat was pitching all over the place. And I have a very strong memory of being at the helm, because we were taking it in turns where everyone else would be inside and one person would be outside, and you'd be tied to the boat and you'd be being battered by waves. And I was quite scared. And then I remember looking through the hatch and Bob was just stood up with a cup of tea, just looking completely relaxed. And so when you see Bob like that, you know that you're probably okay. But yeah, it's a very different environment to what I'm used to filming in. But I don't know, I'm not sure I'll be taking up sailing or making films about sailing, put it that way.
I think that's also one of the interesting things, or the things that draw you in to watch these kind of films, and especially documentaries, because you're watching these events unfold that are very risky and dangerous in many situations. And I think also the question for you as a filmmaker is how do you think in those moments that are very kind of dangerous to also take out your camera and film?
Yeah, it's a funny one actually. I think you just have to try not to think about it too much, really. Yeah, so I guess it's just part of it as well. And in some ways, filming I find almost it helps. It's almost a bit of a distraction that you can be in a dangerous situation, but you're so kind of absorbed with filming that you kind of forget about it a little bit. I mean, the boat generally was okay. I mean, apart from that crossing to St Kilda, that definitely felt quite dangerous at times. But it's far less dangerous than a lot of the climbing sort of things I've done in the past, which are definitely more dangerous, and you just can't get away from that. But as I say, I often find that I'm more aware of danger and more concerned about danger when I'm climbing personally than when I'm filming in those situations, because you're just so absorbed in trying to get the right shots and stuff that you just kind of forget about it, I guess. And I think it's the more you do it as well, the more you just kind of you just get used to working in those environments. I think for a lot of filmmakers as well, I've worked with filmmakers who haven't really worked in those environments before. It's one of the initial hurdles that you have to get over is being worried about damaging your kit. And it's often like people are so concerned about the camera getting damaged or wet that, you know, it's a battle just to get the camera out. But I think you just have to accept that you're probably going to break some stuff, but that is just part of it, really.
you have to get a very kind of good kit, or the one that kind of is able to face all
Well,
these
good
different.
insurance is probably more what you need. I break a lot of kit. In fact, I'm on an insurance claim at the moment for 3 lenses, which ended up in a river. So it's pretty normal, unfortunately, but it's just part of filming this kind of thing.
I think I mean, I have other questions, but I think I'm just gonna ask one more before we open up to questions from the audience here.
Sure.
And I wanted to ask, I think, what what have you learned from this experience of making this film? What have you learned from Bob, from Kate, from both of them, and yeah, from the process of making this film?
Yeah, I feel like I've learned quite a lot in a lot of different ways. I mean, from a filmmaker's side of things, but also from a personal side of things, like spending that amount of time with Bob and Kate, and his approach to life was very interesting. I mean, he very much, it's about pursuing the things that you love, but and that kind of degree of how much of that is selfish. And then I don't know, it definitely made me think about a lot of things that you do in life, and yeah, I don't know, that just but also then at the same time seeing how their relationship has endured for so long, and how this, from the outside at first, maybe you'd see Bob going off on trips for so long as being very selfish and detrimental to their relationship, but that has actually helped their relationship, and that it's endured for as long as it has because of the fact that Bob did those things. And Kate wasn't just a kind of stay-at-home mum who just did nothing. She very much had her own passions. She was a midwife, and she was a nurse, and she did all these things. And it was that thing of, they got to do things that they were passionate about, but then also got to spend time together. And I think that was quite, it was very interesting to see that kind of that relationship working in that way. And then from a filmmaking side of things, it was difficult. I mean, I very much always focus on story, but I say that the whole sort of story of Alzheimer's and everything that goes along with it, it was tough, and I did find it very hard to film at times, and you can't help become quite emotionally attached to it. So I think that was a new experience for me, was filming something that was so personal and so kind of emotional for both of them, and it was definitely difficult at times, but yeah, I don't know, I guess it's just giving me a new perspective on how to deal with those sort of sensitive subjects and those relationships, and that whereas in the past maybe I would have steered clear of them, it's kind of understanding how you can approach those subjects, but in a kind of sensitive way that you create an interesting film, but then at the same time you're still sensitive to their feelings and how you being there can affect everything that's going on. So yeah, I guess that's the main thing I learned, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And it was also, I think, overall very inspiring film to watch, and to see how people of all ages can pursue their kind of dreams, and as obstacles come through, it's still.
Yeah, and I'll say that, to be honest, that is the other thing that really I took out of this project, is just seeing old age, and like this idea that once you retire, for example, that you just sit around and do nothing. And Bob just completely just breaks that mold. It's quite strange spending time with him, because although he's now in his mid-80s, you often forget that he's that kind of age. He's so nimble on the boat, he moves around, and he's so active that you completely forget that he's 86 now. It's quite a strange thing, because I say you perceive old age as being like you passed it and you just sit at home and watch TV, but that, I don't know, spending time with Bob made me realize that really that isn't the case. And if you are passionate about things, that it's just irrelevant what age you are almost. You can still go out and do these things. And actually also that remaining active is a hugely important thing in later life. I mean, it's that thing of, Bob always says that, is, what's his phrase? You have to keep going. Let me get this right. I'm going to get this wrong. to keep going, you have to keep going. Essentially, he means you have to remain active in order to be able to carry on doing these things. And as soon as you stop pursuing the things that you love, then that's kind of game over, really. So I guess it's really kind of changed my perspective on old age, really.
Yeah. Thank you. So do we have any questions from the audience, or any comments on if you've watched the film?
I've got a question here. Yeah, it's always difficult. Funnily enough, my background is actually in sound. So I did a lot of sound before I got into filmmaking, which I think has really benefited me in a lot of ways. I deal with a lot of other people who are in this industry who don't have a deeper understanding of sound, and often I do also do a lot of sound design and things like that, and so I spend a lot of time fixing the kind of things that you would expect to happen whilst filming in those locations, like wind noise and all the things that go along with it. So I think being very aware of sound has definitely helped. Like, I'm always very aware of whether you'll be able to hear people. So I have little portable recorders, and I use good quality microphones with wind protection and stuff. But it is even doing all that, it can still be very difficult. And you definitely have to fix some things with sound design. But it's just all part and parcel of it, really. I mean, it would obviously be a benefit to have a sound person there, but just it being in that environment, often it's not really very possible. And actually, sometimes, I mean, I've been on bigger corporate shoots where you're filming climbing and you have a whole team of people, including a sound man, and actually it's detrimental to the shoot overall because it's just an extra factor to play in, and they have to get into position and all of that kind of stuff. So most of the time I'll just approach sound on my own. And I say I have these little tiny portable recorders which you attach to the subject, and you can just leave them recording, and generally, unless the weather is really, really bad, you will get some kind of usable audio, but it's just part of filming in those locations, really.
Thank you for the question. There's another comment in the chat. An excellent piece of work, moving and thoughtful, very well crafted, shot and edited appropriately.
Thank you. Yeah, that was good. I say the edit really goes down to Erica East. She edited it, but it was a really fun process, actually, because that's I guess the other thing that I've really learned from this project was that often in the past, because the industry is quite niche, I would often shoot and edit, and you can't help if you do that. You're a bit too close to what you've shot to then create the best film that you can. So it was actually really enjoyable working with Erica, where essentially she created some initial kind of assemblies of the project, and then we kind of worked on it together. But I definitely think it ended up being a different film than if I tried to edit it myself. So it's quite enjoyable, because often especially with adventure film, you'll be in an amazing location and you'll get some really good shots, and you love these shots, and then you're so attached to them in the edit that you have to keep them in no matter what, even if it means that the end film is in some ways worse. So having someone else to say, no, we're going to lose this shot because it's far better this way, that was quite fun, really.
You also had these limitations for this film that it had to be under 30 minutes. So
that was tough. That was really tough. I think easily it could have been feature length. I mean, Bob is just there's so much more. I mean, that was definitely a hard part of the edit process, is that because initially it was going to be a film about Bob and his life, and he's been on just so many adventures. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I mean, I remember we were talking to the BBC about health and safety and things, and they were asking about Bob's experience and whether he had any sailing qualifications, but sailing qualifications didn't really exist when Bob got into sailing. So I just sent Bob an email and saying, do you have any qualifications? And he replied saying, no, but I've sailed 150,000 miles. I've been to the Arctic 20 plus times. I've been to the Antarctic this number of times. I've sailed the Northwest Passage twice. So you could really easily have made an hour-long film just about the things that Bob has done in his life. So I think it was very hard to kind of put that aside and really just focus on Bob and Kate, whilst trying to provide some context to the things that Bob has done. And again, I think that's a part of it which can be difficult, is that through knowing Bob, you kind of, obviously I know the things that he's done, and many people who've seen Bob previously will know the thing that he's done, but trying to get a kind of hint of that in the film for people who haven't haven't seen Bob before, don't know any of his backstory. So yeah, that was quite tough to try and cut it down to that half hour. It's definitely a struggle at times.
And the use of archives and photos and things was very useful, as well, as you said, to create that kind of background to.
Yeah, it was funny. It was
backstory.
Bob it's so funny how Bob can be like this. I remember asking him when we started, do you have any old photos or archive? And he's like, no, nothing really, like nothing at all. And then one of the times I was at his house, I suggested that, do you have any old photos? And I'll give you and Kate something to talk about. And then he produced these like huge boxes, like full of photos, like, which I don't even think Bob realized still existed. He just managed to find them in the back of a cupboard somewhere. And there was just so much in there, which was just, that for me was probably the most enjoyable part of the whole film, was just rummaging through these boxes of photos and producing things that then sparks conversation between Bob and Kate, and also just seeing Bob's reaction to photos that he hadn't seen, in years and years and years. I mean, there was a photo of him. So after his dad was shot and he escaped Malaya, he eventually ended up back in Britain and he was put into a boarding school. And there was a photo of the school from when he was 5 or 6, and he had no idea this photo existed. So seeing his reactions to this photo of, like, and he could pick out his friends and the teachers and things like that, and I just loved that. It was amazing. So having all that archive was just brilliant. But it's quite funny actually. His daughter Debbie, she contacted me recently saying, I've seen all these photos in the film that I had no idea existed. Like, do you know where they are? Like, I've asked Bob and he says he doesn't know where they are, and so I had to kind of say they're probably at the house somewhere. He's probably just put them back in a cupboard. So I think she was quite happy that that I'd found all these photos again, really. So I think Bob was quite happy just to kind of chuck them away. He didn't really seem that bothered about a lot of them, but I think his family are obviously quite keen to keep hold of them. So.
Yeah, and especially as the film also kind of engages with that idea of memory and of kind of preserving those kind of achievements, and also the kind of memory of the relationship and the marriage and everything. We have a question from Katie asking, what do you think the biggest obstacle is to getting wider exposure and funding for adventure films?
Yeah, that is a really tough one, and one I'm not really sure I know the answer to. I think there's many obstacles, really. But actually, I'm cautiously optimistic about the future of adventure film. I mean, obviously Free Solo, the film about Alex Honnold soloing El Capitan, it broke out of the genre in a huge way, really. I've never seen that happen before, where a film about climbing has reached such a global audience. I mean, it won an Oscar for Best Documentary, so it's amazing, really. And now often when people ask me what I do, they say, oh, so if you've seen Free Solo and if you make films like Free Solo, but unfortunately I don't make films quite like that. But that really kind of, I think, changed the industry in some ways. It kind of broadened the audience for it massively. And then, for example, like this year, there's a film called The Alpinist, which has just come out, which is in a very similar vein to Free Solo, and that's been picked up by Universal. And I think that is a very positive sign that that kind of outdoor world, I think, is slowly starting to reach a wider audience. And I guess my hope is that these films coming through will make it more attractive to these big funders in future to kind of take on these projects. But it's still very difficult. I mean, it's something I definitely struggle with. I'd say in a lot of ways, I'd say one of the biggest obstacles to funding is just having those connections to even go about trying to find that funding. It's very, very hard. I think it's really difficult. And so, yeah, I would say that's probably one of the biggest obstacles. In terms of exposure, I don't really know, to be honest. Yeah, so that's a difficult one. As I say, I think it is slowly reaching a wider audience. I think a younger audience as well. Like I see what's happening with YouTube, and although it's a completely different world. I mean, it's not. It's kind of very much kind of fast food, kind of vlog style content. There's clearly an appetite for that kind of thing, and my hope is that if people are kind of consuming that they will then also have an interest in longer form documentary pieces. But I'd say it's yet to happen really in a lot of ways, and I'd say in many ways over the last decade, it's actually kind of almost moved backwards in terms of difficulties with funding longer films. I think just as the world has evolved, and again partly because of things like YouTube, is that when I started, you'd get funding from big brands of outdoor equipment, for example, or something along those lines, and they would essentially give you a pot of money which would just about cover the cost of making the film, and then you would sell it through DVDs and downloads online, and that's how you would fund it essentially, and that has just fallen off a cliff basically. It's very, very, very hard. I mean, obviously DVDs have gone by the way, but even downloads really, it's very difficult to even make any money back in that way. And even the brands that were putting in money originally for these kind of projects now aren't willing to do so, because they see a lot of consumers aren't, they're more interested in watching little clips on YouTube and Instagram and all of that kind of stuff. And they can see that in terms of, at the end of the day, they're running a business, and that putting their money into clips for YouTube and Instagram is far more profitable for them than it is for funding a longer documentary piece. So I think that's quite difficult. But then, as I say, I hope that other kind of funding avenues are starting to appear. And I say, this film is one of those. I mean, that was really very much how this came about, was that I wanted to make a film with Bob, but I had no idea how to go about funding that. Although Bob is a very, very interesting character, that more conventional route in the way I funded films before, where brands have funded it, they were less inclined to fund this because I don't know, I guess in some ways it's kind of aligning with their brands, and this was a very kind of different film to that. And so at first I was very unsure whether I'd be able to find any funding, and that's how Right Here and working with SDI actually came about, was that I saw that as an opportunity. And so I think that's really, I hope, is where the future is that these kind of initiatives and stuff will help kind of those kind of films reach a wider audience. I guess that's my hope anyway, but I guess we'll wait and see.
Yeah, and I think, through this program and by being broadcast on BBC Scotland and being available on iPlayer, it's hopefully kind of helping to do that and to reach to a broader audience.
And I think places like sort of Netflix and Amazon Prime, I definitely see more kind of adventure-based content on those platforms, I think. And so I hope that the more exposure people get to that kind of content, the more interest there will be, and the more likely there is that there'll be funding available. But it's always difficult, I think.
So do you have any projects you're working on, or what is kind of your future
I have
projects?
a few ideas, but it's a bit of a kind of, I don't know, it's been a bit of a strange period really since finishing the Bob film. It's as I'm sure many people in the sort of film industry, it's very much just kind of survival mode, I guess, just with the pandemic and everything that goes along with it. And so really, since kind of the spring and the Bob film finishing, I've just very much been just doing corporate work, essentially, just because unfortunately it pays the bills often better than the documentary stuff that I enjoy doing that kind of things far more. But at the moment it's just very much just making sure I can put food on the table. So some of those projects have taken a bit of are on a bit of a back burner at the moment, but I have a few ideas that are kind of coming forward, but nothing that I really want to talk about publicly yet, but hopefully soon. We'll see.
And hopefully we'll see more kind of adventures in Scotland as well. And
Yeah, definitely.
exploring. Yeah. Okay, so are there any other questions or comments? I think we have time for one more, if there is one. Otherwise, I think we can wrap up by just saying that go on and watch the film if you haven't already. It's really interesting and emotional and full of adventure as well. And thank you very much, Chris, for joining us this morning and for sharing more about your experience of making this film. And yeah, and I hope you can also on our website, we will post more kind of resources to read more, how to find out more about Bob's work and books, and to stay updated on his next adventures as well. So thank you very much for joining us this morning and for your questions and comments. And yeah, our next coffee morning event is in 2 weeks from now, so on the 12th of October, and we will speak with the filmmakers of Isabel's Independence, our other Right Here film. So I hope you can watch that one before that event as well. So thank you very much again, and have a good rest of the day.